Welcome to the podcast Jak ty, Ukraine Life. Jak ty means how are you in Ukrainian. I'm your host, Luzia Tschirky, a former correspondent, now a book author and a freelancer. Today's guest on the show is Lisa Yasko. Lisa Yasko is a Ukrainian politician, cultural affairs expert, and film producer. She's been a member of Ukraine's parliament since 2019, focusing on foreign policy and working on defend her country's sovereignty. Lisa studied at Taras Shevchenko National University in Kyiv and later earned a master's degree at Oxford Blavatnik School of Government. Beyond politics, she produced a documentary on Russia's occupation of Crimea, and on a personal note, she is mother to a 3-year-old daughter. Lisa, welcome to the podcast. It's a real honor to have you here.
Thank you for your invitation.
I start this podcast with the question, Jak ty zaraz? How are you right now?
That's a very difficult question to all of us. Very hard summer. I think it's the hardest summer since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, because the attacks in Kyiv and over Ukraine became so massive that it is very hard to stay mentally and physically healthy. And of course, on a global scale, things look very, very sad.
I just cannot imagine how difficult life must be for all of you living in Ukraine. At the beginning, I would like to briefly talk about the very first day of the full-scale invasion, February 2022. Back then, you were in the capital of Ukraine, you were in Kyiv, and you were pregnant at this time. When you first heard about the full-scale invasion, what was going through your mind at this point in time?
Well, all of us couldn't believe that it was happening. And in my head, when I woke up to the sound of explosions, my main thought was how to get to the parliament, because we have to vote for the martial law. And I was almost 7 months pregnant and still was trying not to make it very public, because because of the reasons of who the father of my child is, I didn't want to be exposed even more to the Russian propaganda. So I was thinking that I have to be in the parliament and how to get there. And I called my father, I woke him up. He was sleeping. I called my mother. She also didn't hear the explosion because she has some hearing problems. And I thought, okay, that's actually the good moment when you have a hearing problem, because you didn't hear that yet. Yeah. So it was the first moments, and I was trying to understand what shall I bring with me to the parliament. And then I just went by car. So that was it.
You said that you were not publicly speaking at this point in time about your pregnancy because of the father of the child, and you did not want to get exposed more to Russian propaganda as you already were, just by being a member of the Ukrainian parliament, I assume, yeah? Can you briefly tell to listeners who are not familiar with your personal life who the father of the child is and why you were trying not to publicly announce the pregnancy at this point of time?
So before full-scale invasion, I was in the relationship with Mikheil Saakashvili, who is the former president of Georgia. We lived as one family, as a happy family, and we were planning to have a child. And he went to Georgia and got arrested exactly around the time when I got pregnant. I was going every week to visit a prison in Georgia. And since he is the enemy of Russia, it was very much the topic of lots of Russian propaganda. And I was not very careful in thinking about my security. I actually never thought about my security, but I think some of the mother's instinct start to work at certain stage. So I didn't want to make it public just because I didn't want the propaganda, the media to talk about all of this. And also the fact that Mikheil was poisoned and many very bad things were happening to his human rights situation. I didn't want our personal story that our daughter will be born to be in the heart of attention. But that's very sad, because I was thinking more about the propaganda and other things rather than about myself, about my health and my daughter.
It's challenging to become a parent anyway, and I cannot imagine how difficult that must have been, becoming a mother during a full-scale invasion while your country was invaded by the Russian army, and while the Russian army was attacking, and unfortunately still attacking, hospitals and maternity wards, how did you manage to cope in this situation and just not to freeze in anxiety?
Well, it's very, I cannot answer this question. Things that were happening in that hours and days are a part of the history. And you didn't have time to think, you just had to act. And I was staying in Kyiv for the first days of the full-scale invasion. And then after I understood that the sabotage groups are already working in Kyiv, that everyone knows where our house is, where we used to live, that maybe it makes sense to start moving somewhere more western part of Ukraine. But I'm not the person with anxiety from all of that. I have, unfortunately, different pages of my life connected to the hardcore. So whether I do have some immune system to it or no, I don't know. I don't like to think this way, because sometimes I wish I had much easier life, but I don't. So that's how it happened. And I didn't have time to think. I just had to make decisions.
I recently talked to a very good friend of mine in Kyiv. She told me that she just got so tired of the constant air raids and the sirens that she decided that she cannot go up at night and seek shelter because she's just so tired and she needs some sleep. How are you seeking shelter, especially when you're having a family?
We don't go to shelter, because if you go to the shelter all the time, you just cannot keep up with your life. The air sirens are every day, very often 3, 4, 5 times per day. And if you react to all of that, you will not survive. But sometimes when there are massive attacks, especially recently, it's just not possible to keep sleeping. So you wake up to that terrible sounds of drones speeding up, then air defense working, then ballistic missiles flying. You hear that it's very close or a little bit further. And that's not the sounds where you can still stay in bed. So in my case, I take my daughter and we go to the corridor and sometimes to the bathroom. But that's not like something that provides security, just some small extra measures. But in fact, of course, you have to have like a proper shelter. But we don't really have that. And also there are cases when people die in the shelter if there is a missile that reaches the shelter. It happened, especially recently, a number of times. So it's not something that gives you 100% guarantee.
A mother of a 2-year-old child told me, a mother living close to Kyiv, that her 2-year-old daughter already can differentiate between the sounds of a drone and the sound of a missile. Is this situation the same experience you have as a mother, that your daughter already can, differentiate at such a young age between the different weapons the Russian army is using against Ukraine?
No, she cannot differentiate the types of weapons, but she can definitely differentiate that there is an air alarm, because she goes to the kindergarten and they go immediately to like the underground, and very often it happens during the time when they sleep. So the teachers wake them up, and then, a child didn't sleep. Of course, the whole day goes in the wrong direction. So I also have a dog, and the dog, it's something actually that I find very sad, because the dog simply doesn't sleep the whole night from anxiety and from the fear because of all these sounds. And I think if my dog could talk, she would tell for sure different types of the sounds, because she definitely knows sometime even before the air alarm comes, and then the whole night she doesn't sleep.
I'm so sorry to hear about your dog. When I'm correctly informed, you have a Swiss Shepherd, right? Such a nice dog, by the way. Such a nice dog you have.
Beautiful, yes.
Can you tell us more about your working life? What does a typical day, if something like this actually exists, looks like for a member of parliament, during a full-scale invasion?
So when we have a plenary days, which means that we need to be in the parliament and to vote for the laws. After almost every second, and now very often almost every night of non-sleeping and air sirens and missiles, We just, at 7, 8 o'clock in the morning, we keep going with our life. After the sleepless night, we are going to the parliament, we're going to the kindergartens, bringing our children to the schools, kindergarten, doing all things that usual person would do, but very exhausted feeling.
I was very astonished to read that, during this whole time of the full-scale invasion, that meetings were held in person, that members of parliament were actually always meeting in person, that Rada, like that's the name for the Ukrainian parliament, that they never moved fully online. So you met in person. How did you manage to do that, to keep on working under these circumstances? How was that possible?
There is no other answer. We just kept working. That's the thing. We are not allowed to have this voting online during the plenary, so the only physical presence matters. I think we do understand how important some of the votes are and how it is important to defend your country. So we have to be there. Some of the people who are not living full-time in Kyiv, for instance, if they have constituencies in other parts of Ukraine, they commute for every second week to the parliament. Yes, but I can tell you that most of the people do have problems with health, with mental health already, because you cannot survive as a healthy person for a long time under such circumstances.
When you could talk to your former self, that got elected at the age of 28, if I'm not mistaken, what would you advise, your former self, Lisa Yasko, in 2019?
I would say to myself that don't have illusions. It's going to be a hell. And hell on every possible topic, including personal life, including family, including professional, including security, including geopolitics. It's going to be a hell, a real hell. And just if you can prepare yourself better to be healthy and maybe to rely on some people that you trust, check people like their moral qualities more, don't trust everyone. I think that could help a little bit, but in general, I don't think that things that happen to my life is something that a person can prepare to, because you cannot prepare to have the full-scale invasion. You cannot prepare suddenly to become a single mother. I mean, without planning to be a single mother. You cannot prepare for that. But then one day, things happen to your life that you cannot control. And then at a certain stage, after lots of pain, that probably doesn't end, but maybe you manage to accept some of that pain, you stand up and you keep going.
In a speech you gave last year at the Geneva Summit for Human Rights, you said, and I quote now, "So what has changed since February 2022? For us Ukrainians, we've learned that we shouldn't be naive and we should rely only on ourselves." End of quote. Did you feel at any point abandoned, that Ukraine as a country, people living in Ukraine were kind of left alone by other countries, by other parliaments of the world during this full-scale invasion?
To a certain extent, for sure, because I don't think that any of other society, country could relate so much to what happened to Ukraine and to our lives. So it's very hard to accept and even to imagine. So definitely we feel most of the time very abandoned, but in the same time we do have the feeling of the solidarity that comes from some human part of the European society, and not only, and I'm very grateful to it, that so many people from Ukraine got so many hands of support by people opening their doors to provide a shelter in the time when it is very needed.
When looking at what you were focusing before the war on a political level, how did your focus and your initiatives also in Parliament, how did they change during the full-scale invasion?
They changed a lot, because before the full-scale invasion, I was working on a foreign affairs, of course, questions of national security, sanctions, but some of these questions were very hard to push even internally. But when the full-scale invasion happened, then all of these questions were finally the central in our work. And if you wanted to do something about other parts in politics, such as, I don't know, social, environmental issues, that's not longer so much a priority. For instance, you cannot really get budget funding for questions of culture or education so much, which is very sad. I think it's very wrong. But in the same time, we do need to provide more and more funding to defense. And that's not what I like. I don't like that, for instance, we also had to vote in favor for increasing the tax system in Ukraine. But that's important to get money to our defense budget. So we have to do it. But in general, I'm against it if it was not a war. But I'm supporting it because I understand that during the war, it is important.
Could it be dangerous for you when you meet actually as all the members of parliament are gathered in one place? Or would you say that there is not a threat to the Ukrainian parliament when all members of parliament are meeting? How is that?
We don't have enough security. We just sacrifice our lives all the time. We, as the society, as the nation, and even as members of the parliament, we do understand that there are always risks. We do understand that we can be targeted. We do understand that. But we are not special, Everyone can be targeted and everyone can suffer. So there is no any single, more security for the parliament for sure. I wish there was, but there is not.
You briefly mentioned your parents, that they also live in Kyiv. Was there ever a discussion within your family whether to stay in Ukraine or not? Has that ever come up during the whole time of the full-scale invasion?
So my parents don't want to leave, and my father is working as a music teacher, and my mom is very fatalistic, which I really don't like. So I think this is the conversation that sometimes I can start thinking about, because if the circumstances were different, I think it makes sense to keep a part of your family away from the fire, But in the circumstances where, of my life, we all stay in Kyiv.
What you mean by your mother is sometimes fatalistic? What do you mean by that?
So many Ukrainians, including my mom, they believe that if the ballistics or drone flies to your window and you're going to die, then that's the destiny. And I don't like that approach.
You think that this could be a sign of also kind of a mental reaction, in a way that your mental health, after a certain point in time, you're not able to cope anymore with this amount of stress?
Yes and no, because of course it affects your mental health, but in the same time, this kind of approach and position is something that was shared from the beginning of the war by many, many people who decided they are not leaving their houses even when they were Russian tanks 1 kilometer away. Because for us, our land is very important, our soil is very important, and people just cannot imagine leaving their house and their soil. That's very, I would say, spiritual and very special approach, which is not rational, but also helps us in many ways. But I think the best actually would be somewhere in between, because I believe that you should be taking care of your security sometimes, at least.
I assume that being a member of parliament, you feel a special duty for the people, who voted for you, being an elected member of parliament. How do you deal with this, additional burden of, being an elected member and feeling a certain responsibility, in front of the electorate? How do you deal with that?
For me, this is hard because I wish I could do much more simple things, but very often people would want things from us that we are not able to deliver, like the global questions, like bringing their life back, the ruined lives, ruined houses, destinies, and that's very sad. But in the same time, I do know that I can contribute a lot to the questions of global justice. I'm working in human rights a lot. And in the Council of Europe, we recently had a special event when the Special Tribunal of the Crime of Aggression was established, which means that Russians who committed war crimes will pay the price in the same way as Nazi pay the price during the Nuremberg process. I think historically this is very important, but I do understand that the result will not come over one night, even 1 year. So it's very long term, and I hate that.
Are you personally trying not to think about how long it will take until soldiers of the Russian army who committed war crimes will face a trial? Are you trying not to think about how long it still will take? Or are you on the opposite, more optimistic that it will happen during our lifetimes?
You know, I'm thinking about the timelines very often because I would want to have a certainty for my country and for my life and for everyone. But there are no exact answers because no one would provide you a timeline. There are so many different circumstances and obstacles. But I do know that it can last. For instance, another question that we contributed to is the creation of register of damage and the compensation mechanism for Ukrainians who lost their houses or other things, and they suffered. There is a huge damage to their life. So the Russia pays money back. We are working now to get the frozen assets and through the compensation mechanism to be able to use for Ukraine recovery, but also for justice. So I think that average Ukrainian person would want to know when the criminal is going to pay the price and when will they get some compensation. No one think it would happen tomorrow, but they believe that it might happen sometime in the future. But statistics say, not statistics, history says that these things can run for 20 years, for 30 years, but still it's needed. That's the process.
As a member of parliament and as someone who studied political science, has there been a point during this whole full-scale invasion that you have ever had the thought that like international institutions such as the United Nations, that they're not really working? That thought ever crossed your mind that they're not efficient and actually reaching their goal as they should?
So international organizations such as United Nations are really dysfunctional, and we are thinking and talking about this all the time. So there is little potential that is left, but in general, these organizations need reform. And Council of Europe has changed in the recent years, is progressing to be very, very active to meet the demands of the time. As I said, the special tribunal was created, and I think that's a great example. But of course, we are talking all the time about this dysfunctional organizations because we just cannot live in illusions anymore. The same thing happens, for instance, to ICRC. I respect ICRC a lot, but ICRC, unfortunately, in Ukraine, on the war with Ukraine and Russia, they don't manage to exercise the mandate that they have. Not because they don't want to, but because Russia doesn't allow to. So it's a problem we should be talking about because we want ICRC to keep working, not by complaining about them, but to give them more opportunities to do so. But let's be honest, Russia is not allowing them to fulfill their mandate, and that's terrible because there is Geneva Conventions. For instance, I'm the author of the resolution on release and exchange of the prisoners of war, of Ukrainian prisoners of war detained in Russia, and that's terrible situation. These people face executions, the violations of the human rights, the tortures, and Russia only selectively decides what kind of information they shall share with ICRC, and that's it. And Russia doesn't allow ICRC to visit these people in detention centers. They don't allow ICRC to track where these people are, to only some small percentage. so that they tick the box that they actually did it. But that's not that practices that should exist anymore. Like, if there are rules, if we are parties of Geneva Convention, that we should respect that. But Russia doesn't respect that.
When people that voted for you, when they're approaching you with complaints, for example, that they have family members who are now prisoners of war by Russia, when they approach you and ask you, could you do something for us? And you see how this organization is not able to help those people in a way that the organization should be helping, how you deal with that?
Well, I think we already reached the point when these people understand that international organizations cannot do so much. So the only hope is actually on our coordination centers, Ukrainian Coordination Center for the exchange of the prisoners of war, and negotiations that we may have with Russia, with the third-party mediators. And that's very important. That's something I advocate a lot, that every member state of the Council of Europe, and not only, has a power to be a mediator on humanitarian questions. So if we cannot end the war, at least we can solve some of the humanitarian questions, such as bringing back prisoners of war, civilians, children, like wounded. There is a long list of humanitarian things that can be done, and we do manage to have some progress on some of that, for instance, of the prisoners of war. But with children, the situation is very bad.
I'm so sorry to hear. If I'm informed correctly, there's about 20,000 Ukrainian children who are in Russia and were sent to Russia against their will, against their relatives' will, which is a terrible situation. You yourself are faced with a situation where your partner and the father of your child, the former president of Georgia, Amnesty International, for example, does not take him as a political prisoner, but he is treated as a political prisoner. You mentioned that he got poisoned. In this situation where the full-scale invasion is going on, and your partner is also a Ukrainian citizen, so he has the Ukrainian passport, are you sometimes afraid that, there is not enough attention for his case due to the millions of people with Ukrainian citizenship, with a Ukrainian passport, who are going through such a hard and difficult time and, have relatives in Russian prisons? Are you sometimes afraid that there is not enough attention on his case?
Well, first of all, let me correct you that we're not together anymore. He's no longer my partner.
I'm sorry.
But it doesn't change anything. There is very small attention on Georgia in general and on his case. Because he is a former president, there is a lot of politicization of his case, and human rights organizations such as Amnesty, they are very careful, very honestly, if to be with you, because it's much easier to defend a journalist rather than a politician. If you're a politician and you got arrested, then people say, it's law enforcement, the court will decide. But if the court is very dependent on the political will, if the country is going Russian direction, so what would you imagine would happen? So that's a big tragedy, what happens to him and to Georgia. It's a very big disease that is spread in Georgian society, and it's very sad that the international community is not paying enough attention to what happens in Georgia. I think it only makes Putin happier, because he really likes the idea that Georgia is under Russian influence. And that's very sad. But unfortunately, I'm living with it already for a long time. Soon it will be 4 years since he's imprisoned, and definitely that's not how we planned our life and how I saw our relationship going. But there is a price for freedom that you pay. His freedom was taken away, and everything was frozen, and he's no longer able to do things he could do, and that's very sad. But I still believe that after things happen in Georgia and when the war is over in Ukraine, there could be some progress on his release. But at this stage, I don't see it happening soon, unfortunately.
I'm very sorry to hear. A good friend of mine, a journalist, told me when I was visiting Kyiv in January this year, told me that in maybe 10 or 15 years in Ukraine, the situation could be comparable to Georgia, as Russia started the war against Georgia in 2008 and to this day is still occupying 20% of the country's territory. In 10 or 15 years, the situation in Ukraine could be comparable to the situation in Georgia, that the territory Russia occupied in Ukraine would still hold this territory in 10 or 15 years. What would you say? How to prevent this scenario that this could happen to Ukraine, what has happened to Georgia?
Because I'm very much into the topic of mentality and differences between Georgia and Ukraine, I do see the risk of what you just said, but I think that Ukrainian mentality and Ukrainian people are very different. We are very good at self-organization. We mobilize very quickly. We are very stubborn people. We do love freedom, and that's something that millions of people are giving away their lives for. Georgians are not always like that. And they do need a leader. We don't need a leader in Ukraine. We are very democratic in fighting each other, but when we have to mobilize against the enemy, we're very good. In Georgia, it's different. And also the Georgian situation is a bit different because Russian influence was coming there gradually and in a very smart, sophisticated way. So people got hopeless and helpless in Georgia. They stopped believing in a change. While Ukrainians always believe in change. And I think it's a big difference, but we are very exhausted now. It's true. And I wouldn't be very optimistic unless we have a chance to have some recovery for human beings inside us. Because to be able to fight, you need to be able to breathe. And if you don't breathe, then you cannot fight.
To end on a little bit more positive note, you once said in an interview that people living abroad, or more specific journalists, should not ask you when the war is going to end. So I will not ask you this question when the war is going to end. I rather ask you what gives you strength to carry on.
I think a change in Europe gives me strength. I'm happy to see some more strength coming from the European leadership. People do give me strength inside Ukraine, but that's quite obviously everyone who is so strong and fighting every day for our freedom, but also abroad, those people who show a face of humanity. It doesn't happen every day, but it does happen. And I do appreciate that. And it gives me personally some strength because I also need sometimes some support and some feeling of solidarity, you know. When someone just asks me, how am I doing? And is asking if there's anything he or she can do to help. This is already a lot. And I really appreciate that. If there is even more help coming.
Thank you so much, Lisa Yasko, for joining me today on the podcast. And I really hope that people who listen to this podcast, will continue their support for Ukraine. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you.